Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. This is something that I've been working on very much as a side project over the course of maybe kind of like the past 18 months or something. I've kind of fallen into, in my opinion, the much overdue task of translating a lot of the why is that going through revisionist materials and anti-revisionist materials within German social democracy. It started with a text by Parvus called Opportunism in Practice, and I did a meeting with that podcast with Lars, who's here, and Mike and some other comrades discussing the implications of that. But in the past 4 months or something, I've been doing a translation of Kautsky's Bernstein and the Social Democratic Program in kind of weekly installments for my Patreon, Marxism Translated. And I thought, Kevin's been asking me to do a talk for a while now, and I am happy to announce I do have a book coming out very soon on something different. This is a book on Clarence II, it's a little booklet, which I'll be speaking at Communist University. But this is more or less a summary of the translation work that I've been involved in the last 4 months or so, looking at Kautsky's response to Bernstein, which we don't have in English. It is available in German, obviously in Russian, I think in Dutch, possibly in French too, but not in English. So that's that's something I'm trying to resolve by getting an English translation out there. And I must apologize in advance, given lack of preparation time. I haven't really, it'll be quite quote heavy. And I don't really want to go into too much contextualization today, just simply because I will run over time. But I wanted to start with Goethe's Faust Part 1. And the reason for this is not my Germanic studies hat, but rather the fact that this passage is often cited by a variety of critics of Edvard Bernstein in the SPD towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in kind of relation to his ideas and his politics. It reads as this: how him alone all hope abandons never, to empty trash who clings with zeal untired, with greed for treasure gropes and joy inspired, exults if earthworms second his endeavor. And Parvus, Luxembourg, even Luxembourg in 1910, I've just finished a huge amount of translation of her speeches in 1910 against the Baden budget approvers, the reformists in the party, and she talks about our eager treasure diggers who find nothing but earthworms and seem to be pleased with the results. So that's what I wanted to start off to set the debate up. Again, so very text-heavy slides, so feel free to look at somewhere else. But this is a kind of short timeline of what we'll be looking at today. Just again, I don't want to go into the whole ins and outs of the revisionist controversy, which had ramifications not only in Germany, but across the entirety of social democracy at the time in the Second International. The Bernstein is in exile, it should be said, from Germany. He's not allowed to go back to Germany, I think, until 1901 or 1903, maybe he returns. And he's writing for Die Neue Zeit, which is Kautsky's paper. And Bernstein, we often see him, quite, in a sense, quite rightly through the prism of Bernstein, the revisionist, the reformist, etc. But if we kind of get that out of our heads for a second and think back to the 1890s, it must be said that Bernstein counts among one of the leading political, theoretical, journalistic authorities in the Marxist movement at the time. He was the editor of the illegal Der Sozialdemokrat in Swiss exile, and played a very key role in the development of German Marxism generally. He starts off a series in 1896, written from London for Kautsky's Die Neue Zeit, called Probleme des Sozialismus, the problems of socialism. And some of the arguments that he makes start to raise a few eyebrows. And some people are thinking, okay, what is going on with Bernstein here? Is he kind of giving up on Marxism? Is he he's questioning some of the fundamental tenets of our party? Is he just kind of playing devil's advocate? Are these questions open, or is he trying to do something with what he's saying? And then over the course of time, it becomes clearer that actually Bernstein is departing from what had been the majority view, what is the majority view of the organization until then, and the view that he upheld about the fundamental principles of social democracy as outlined in the Erfurt program, a party of radical, irreconcilable, hostile opposition to the existing capitalist order, etc., etc. And there's a statement read out on his behalf. Again, he can't be in Germany, in Stuttgart in 1898, where he talks about starting to look again or revise some of the outdated aspects, what he sees as the outdated aspects of Marxist theory, some of the predictions that Marx and Engels made that he felt hadn't come to fruition in various ways in terms of the economy, the concentration of ownership, capitalist concentration in the agricultural sector, etc., etc. And these feed into other debates that were had previously as well in 1894, 1895 on the agrarian question, etc., etc. But at this point in 1898, it does become evident that there is that something big is on the cards here. And even though both in 1898 and in 1899, the general feeling amongst the party Congress is one of almost unanimous opposition to Bernstein's ideas, that does, in a sense, mask some of the support that he had within the party and the right of democracy, and then within the international itself. Partly, this puts Kautsky will be one of the main people we look at today in a rather tricky position, because again, until that point, Kautsky and Bernstein were kind of best buddies. They both studied with Marx and Engels, although there's a kind of interesting episode in 1880 where Bernstein's actually called to London for a bit of a bollocking from Marx and Engels about something that he had written in collaboration with Karl Hirschberg, who was a kind of very wealthy social democrat with kind of academic Marxist leanings about class collaboration, etc. And that leads to a big, almighty fallout. And in some of the German historiography, you'll see that this was the kind of pre-revisionist Bernstein already back in 1880. I don't find that particularly helpful, but it's worth at least flagging here and noting that that's what happened. But Bernstein and Kautsky say they're two of the leading lights within social democracy. They work on the Erfurt program, as we all know. And Kautsky is put in a bit of a tricky situation in the sense that, particularly after 1898, there are calls from people like Zetkin, Parvus, Luxemburg, who are writing responses to some of the claims that Bernstein is making. Why doesn't Kautsky come out and say something about some of these things that Bernstein is putting out there, and Kautsky is leaving them kind of unanswered, right? And Kautsky, after much to and fro, and you can see recently the entirety of the Bernstein-Kautsky correspondence has been published in German. It dries up in 1900, has to be said, as we'll see. Spoiler alert. But Kautsky's view is, okay, there's nothing wrong per se in and of itself with revising or looking to renew or update or even contradict some of the ideas that we've developed and inherited in the Marxist tradition, etc., in line with the circumstances in which we find ourselves. However, I'm not entirely sure what you're doing here is doing that. What you're basically doing is posing a number of questions about the theory, but without developing it onto a higher level, without posing anything new. So instead of immediately jumping in, Kautsky makes the suggestion that Bernstein go off and put together his ideas in a single volume, in a book, that kind of combines, but also, as it's also important to note, diverges from some of the stuff he says in the articles. And here we see Bernstein's inconsistency, his kind of hodgepodge nature of his views, which we'll look at later. And that becomes the book, Die Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus und die Aufgaben der Sozialdemokratie, so the preconditions of socialism and the tasks of social democracy. We know it in English as evolutionary socialism. I presume that was a choice made to get away from the kind of clumsy long German title, but yeah, it's not particularly the most accurate. I mean, evolutionary socialism as idea, yes, I can see why they've gone for that, but it's not really it's not in the original title, which may or not be very helpful. And it's also, I mentioned the debates around the agrarian question, the rise of kind of elements that are looking to break with or frustrated with the revolutionary strategy of the SPD and in the Second International. We also have to note that this comes at a time when many of these forces that perhaps had been in the background more in the past are now coming to the fore, particularly around the Millerand affair and the decision to join a capitalist government in France. So these are all the kind of things that we have to take into consideration in background. And as I say, today I want to look at a little bit at Kautsky's response to Bernstein, and look at some of the things that emerge from it, because it becomes clear when you go, because often Bernstein's book is placed on a pedestal by all sorts of people for all very understandable reasons. And the great strength, I think, of looking at Kautsky's response is not just that it's a response from somebody who knows him very well, politically, intellectually, etc., but it's also, you're also able to trace the jumps to and for the leaps around that Bernstein makes intellectually and politically when composing this book, and how he contradicts himself, etc. And Kautsky, at times, I must admit that the read isn't the most inspiring, or it's quite tough going at times. But Kautsky's very good at bringing out these contradictions, bringing out the fact that Bernstein often will just will cull quotes from Marx and Engels to make a point that they then, themselves would refute 3 lines down or whatever. And I want to look at it also on a level of Marxist theory, because again, many of these ideas, we talk of fatalism, which we'll talk about in a second, the so-called theory of immiseration for Elendung, Marx versus Engels, Marxism versus Engelsism, Marxism versus Kautskyism, breakdown theory, or the theory of the breakdown, all of these things that are kind of ingrained to a certain sense within our lexicon even today, but the origins of which we're not always so sure about. And I want to make the claim today that I think Bernstein may have been the first person to call Kautsky a fatalist, but certainly not the last. But before we have a closer look at Kautsky's reply, I just wanted to look at something else that I've translated, which I did last year, which is Parvis's Opportunism in Practice. Parvis making actually very similar points to Kautsky, as we'll see, but in a series of articles also in Die Neue Zeit in 1901, so slightly later. And I translated this last year. It's a wonderful text. It's now available on the Marxist Internet Archive under the Parvis archive, so I can send you a link to that. That's a fun read. But the reason I think it's useful to look at this is to also kind of get our heads around a little bit. That's the Parvis archive, by the way, with a quote from my translation. Get our heads around the fact that when we speak of opportunism or revisionism, it's not just Bernstein, it's not just Bernstein's particular wing of the party. There's the trade unions, but there are also different manifestations of it reflected in around other thinkers. So for Parvis, he says the fact that opportunism is so muddle-headed intellectually ensures that its manifestations are most diverse, and he highlights 3 trends. There could be more. I'd say certainly that later on, subsequently, the trade unions would be one, and the kind of trade union understanding of social democracy. But he talks about statesmen and the art of the possible, as represented in Georg von Vollmar. Sorry, that's loud. You may have seen in Mike McNair's article this week a brief discussion of who von Vollmar was. He was a radical leftist in the period of illegality of the SPD, 1878 to 1890. Very forcible advocate of the general strike strategy, etc. But then in the middle of the 1890s, in a series of speeches that I've also started to translate, the so-called El Dorado speeches, after the name of the pub in Munich where he gave them, starts to, long before Bernstein sets out with his theoretical revisionism, so-called, starts to question some of the tenets of the strategy as outlined in the effort program. The second category is Ignaz Auer, Nazi hours, they called him at the time, the practical politicians. And then thirdly, Bernstein, who we'll look at obviously in closer detail. So yeah, Vollmar is very much in the possibilist camp, and Parvis identifies some traits by which you can kind of see these people. He talks about statesmanship, and by this I mean the art of political and parliamentary arrangements, which certainly should not be underestimated. Above all, this includes a sharp eye for the current interactions between the parliamentary parties and the politics of the government. Such a statesman-like view is certainly useful to every politician, including social democrats. Right? So it's like understanding that your politics and your perspective should flow from the existing constellation, or should be largely informed by the existing constellation in parliament, between the government, public opinion, etc. But he says social democracy needs more. For as a social revolutionary party, the question of development is more important than is the current balance between the parties. The basis of all our work, after all, is economic development, which revolutionizes social stratification, alters the balance of power between the political parties, reshapes government policy, and, with a strong amount of confidence, certainly in retrospect, must bring us to power. Social democracy reckons with factors of which the bourgeois statesman is not even aware. So the basic point being is that possibilists will often base their perspectives on certain choices that are set or given within the existing capitalist framework, without kind of seeing the elephant in the room, as it were, the social fabric, the structure of society, which creates that kind of false choice of two or three choices that we have in bourgeois politics. Then we get into the idea of attainable goals, positive achievements. So again, a constant refrain across the three trends of opportunism that Parvus outlines would be, you know, this idea that we are a party of the negative. We negate things. We don't have anything positive to say. We're just opposed to what exists, and that's not enough, right? And yes, it generally overestimates the importance of government, not to be confused with governmental power itself, and the parliamentary majority likes to overlook the fact that the governmental power, government, parliament, and the entire political organization in the country, including the military, is in the hands of the ruling capitalist class. And I'm sure if I were to put a hands up at this point in the session, you know, you could think of a whole number of leftists who've kind of taken this goal, and in a sense, it's kind of partly informs the logic of where the labor movement is today in terms of its dominance by reformist possibilities. The idea that, you know, we basically have to work with what's realistic, what's attainable, so-called, and realistic, which essentially means it's taking good coin the logic and structure of capitalist society, the capitalist state, etc. But again, I would recommend Mike's article on that this week, just looking at some modern examples. The revisionism of the statesman, the suspicion of theory. So this is that should read the practical politicians, first mistake on the slide. The revisions of the practical politicians. These are people who just want to get things done. And I'm sure that many of you will know this quote from Ignaz Auer. Dear Ada, as he was known, Bernstein, these are the kind of things you don't say, you just get on and do them, right? So again, this idea, this notion that basically, you know, we as a party, we don't need this kind of heavy ballast of theory, a theory of social development, an understanding of where the social contradictions are heading, whether they've been fulfilled as we would see them or not. It's basically getting on with doing things and getting the work done that we're already kind of doing anyway. The second quote, you might not know, it's in this book that I was trying to publicize earlier on. Auer made this comment about Clara Zetkin at the Hanover Congress of 1899, which I mentioned, where she gives this big barnstorming speech against Bernstein, and in so doing gets to know Rosa Luxemburg for the first time. And Auer says, if that is the oppressed sex, imagine what things will be like when it has equal rights and is free. At this point, I must also stress that that sexism and these kind of chauvinist attitudes were not confined, unfortunately, to just the right wing of the party. They were across the party, but it gives you perhaps a taste of Auer's mentality when he would see these kind of heavy clashes of political theory and strategy at a Congress, and what his priorities, where his priorities lay. I have a quote here from Luxemburg, just because I've just finished a huge 25,000 words of speeches of hers and writing from 1910, the mass strike controversy. And she talks about practical politicians in a different context, not Auer, but the Badenites, so the right-wing politicians in Baden who approved the local state budget. And she says, there are no problems for these practical politicians. The entirety of their wisdom consists in seizing the opportunity without considering the practical consequences, even if it is only earthworms that our diggers for treasure usually find. And Parvus has a very nice description of Auer here, this as a kind of typical of this mentality. As a practical politician, Auer was suspicious of theory from the outset. The way he then handled theory, as we have seen, must have disappointed him all the more. So it was that his suspicion became skepticism. It was the uniformity of his political outlook that suffered most from all of this. He has his doubts to the left and to the right, and nothing satisfies him. He no longer finds in himself the intellectual confidence to stand up ruthlessly for certain principles. He therefore no longer understands it when others do. I refer you to the quote about the oppressed sex. He sees in it only intolerance and belligerence. His doubts bring him close to opportunism, not because of its positive, but because of its negative qualities, the criticism of the principles being applied. He does not necessarily accept this criticism, but is interested to learn how it will develop and what will become of it. And then we come on to a term which is important subsequently, the term of fatalism. Curiously, at the same time, his skepticism led him to a kind of fatalism. All theorizing, in fact, was a useless waste of time, all speculative foresight, no program, no clear tactics except one: to apply the brakes everywhere. And here too, the more the final goal receives from sight, the addiction to immediate tangible success is awakened. Present day work in the limited bourgeois sense, as I described above. And of course, if there's one sentence, I think slightly misleadingly, but if there's one sentence we kind of all know from Bernstein, not that it's misleading, but it focuses on one small thing of his overall outlook, is, you know, the goal is nothing, the movement is everything. And here you've got the final goal receding from sight. In relation to Auer too. My computer's frozen, 2 seconds. I don't know why it's not. There we go. And then we come to Bernstein's revisionism, and I think these comments from Parvus are helpful because they set up what is a kind of perennial frustration within this debate about trying to pin Bernstein down on what is actually saying. I once remember Mark Fisher saying to me that sometimes pinning down opportunism is like trying to pin jelly to a ceiling. And I think it's a phrase that always kind of springs into my mind when I'm looking through this stuff and reading Kautsky's response to Bernstein. He said, this is the whole of the 4-year-long campaign against Bernstein's revisionism strives for nothing else than clarity, whether to the right or to the left. Shall we continue to stand on the ground of revolutionary socialism, or shall we become a social reformist party? That is the question, as it were. Just let there be no confusion, no mass, no self-deception. But Bernstein is obviously no longer capable of producing a clear and certain position. He has lost the ability to look at things without shifting his point of view, even for a moment. His is a great twirling dance in which he spins around his own axe, with the result that everything around shimmers in a blur. If he is challenged to draw the consequences of his own point of view, then he considers this to be most annoying or even insulting. And this is an interesting episode in the Kautsky-Bernstein relationship. He says, can we imagine a more risible situation than one in which this party reformer, this trailblazer of socialism who wishes to point out new paths to the international proletariat, bitterly and miserably moans about the fact that he was tricked into making his views public? Apparently, by asking him to formulate his views in a book, Bernstein's old friend Kautsky had treated him quite treacherously. What perfidy! After all, Kautsky had to know that Bernstein would make an absolute fool of himself by writing a coherent outline of his revisionism. It is a most, and this is the Mark Fisher thing, I think, some quote, it is the most interesting character trait of revisionism. On the one hand, the more that Bernstein revises, the more talkative he becomes. On the other hand, the more he revises, the more he carries around within the feeling that he should have perhaps remained silent. And we'll look at some concrete examples in Kautsky's response in a second. But there may be a few, saying, okay, and again, this is a product of kind of the 20th century historiography to a large extent. The picture I have at the very start of the presentation is Kautsky. I think this is 1928, so better days when the two have reunited, and indeed those like Lukács would make the point that, essentially, okay, these two guys fell out, but fundamentally their politics were the same. And you might think, well, okay, so it's all well and good going and translating some text, but what's really the point when, the antagonism or the gulf wasn't perhaps as big as we would think, or as it turned out to be. But in that sense, I just wanted to give you two quick book reviews of this Kautsky text, which is Bernstein and the Social Democratic Program, just to emphasize again. This is Lenin. Again, this is on the MIA. You can read it. It's a very interesting review, and it's not really a review. It's more of a kind of exegesis. It's a kind of outline of what Kautsky says, really, without too much by way of commentary, simply because he kind of takes it as kind of common sense. Lenin writes, truth, of course, comes first, says Kautsky, and if Bernstein has become sincerely convinced of the error of his former views, it was his plain duty to give definite expression to his convictions. But the trouble with Bernstein is his lack of precisely this directness and definiteness. His pamphlet is amazingly encyclopedic, as Antonio Labriola has remarked in a French magazine. It touches on a mass of problems, agglomeration of questions, but not on any one of them does it provide an integral and precise exposition of this critic's new views. The critic merely expresses his doubts and abandons difficult and complicated questions without any independent analysis after having scarcely touched upon them. This brings about, Kautsky notes sarcastically, a strange phenomenon. Bernstein's followers understand his book in the most diverse ways, whereas opponents all understand it the same way. Bernstein's chief objection to his opponents is that they do not understand him, that they do not want to understand him. The whole series of newspaper and magazine articles that Bernstein has written in answers to his opponents has failed to explain his positive views. Now, I have a picture of Krupskaya and Lenin then with a cat, or their cat, I assume. Just to make the point that Krupskaya was, I made this point before, but Krupskaya was part of that global elite of people that teach German for a profession, and between the two of them, they sat down and they got a Russian translation of this text by Kautsky done within the space of about a week, which puts me to shame slightly, and certainly everyone else in the past 100-odd years. And I'm sure, and Lars is here, you could correct me if I'm wrong later on, but I think it wasn't the only translation prepared by Russian revolutionaries at the time, and I'm sure there were competing ones. Luxembourg's particularly important. So obviously you have the Kautsky-Lenin thing, which is controversial in and of itself, but also I think also Luxembourg, because often the way this stuff is portrayed, these controversies are portrayed, is that basically you have in 1898 to 1901, around that time, you have the right, Bernstein, the center, Kautsky, and the left, Luxembourg, Parvus, etc. And the point I would make is that fundamentally, Parvus and Kautsky make the same points, right? Their approach is different in the sense that Parvus is not so, in a sense, not as fear is not the right word, but he doesn't give Bernstein as much as room as Kautsky does in terms of actually quoting precisely what he says and how he contradicts himself and all the rest of it. But Luxembourg's social reform or revolution, again, another misleading thing in the translation, just reform or revolution, social reform or revolution. Again, very similar points to Kautsky. They're making the case for the revolutionary outlook of social democracy against its undermining. And that's important. We'll see why in a second. But she just writes this. This is actually Bernstein complaining in a letter. He says that people are ganging up on him. He says this is also being confirmed in an article in the Leipzig Volkszeitung, a left-wing newspaper, which undoubtedly comes from a person very close to Kautsky, comrade Luxembourg. It speaks of the revisionist dithering and waving, and he said that Kautsky's booklet, i.e. the one we're discussing here, is like a breath of fresh air in the fog of revisionism. Now, again, if you look at Cold War historiography, I've just picked out one. This is actually later, so it's technically post-Cold War just historiography. This is Stanley Pearson, I think, in Harvard, Marxist Intellectuals and the Working Class Mentality. His fundamental take is that Bernstein and his allies are essentially seeking to resolve a dilemma within the SPD, that is, it is an evolutionist, fatalist party that doesn't take any political action, but waits for the inevitable collapse of capitalism, etc. And Bernstein and others realize, come to save the day, that is kind of the they have to resolve this dilemma of, okay, we're waiting passively for revolution. What do we do now? And the way that Pearson and many, many others will then describe Luxembourg is that she was also a revisionist of this orthodoxy, but from the left, i.e., so draws radically different conclusions to Bernstein, but also fundamentally takes up or distances herself from or offers something new to the so-called fatalist evolutionist strategy of the SPD as outlined in the Erfurt program. So I think that's also worth highlighting. There is the question, and I've talked about this before, about 1910 and how the gaps open up and things become much more complicated within the camp of revolutionary social democracy, if you like. But certainly at this point, they're singing from the same hymn sheet. So how long have we got? Yeah, so about 10-15 minutes. I don't want to spend too long, but I just want to highlight some of the things that I've found quite interesting while going through this translation. I'm about halfway through now, I think. So halfway through section 2 on program, and some of the things that stuck out to me that are interesting in terms of the history of the ideas of Marxism, etc. Particularly on this level of on the level of the dismissal of Second International Marxism, Kautskyism, whatever, evolutionism, determinism, fatalism, etc. Because what becomes apparent very quickly by reading Bernstein and Kautsky's response to Bernstein is that a lot of these things that the left has taken up as kind of good coin and common sense, as it were, in its critique of the failings of the Second International, they actually originate either with Bernstein or with those in the bourgeois academic circles that really rejoice at the fact that somebody of such a high profile within the SPD is starting to make some of the very same points that they've been making for some time against Marxism, whether that be, as we'll see, marginal utility theory, the theory of the collapse, and all the rest of it. So that's things that stick out here. Breaks down into 3 parts: method, program, and tactics. And again, method is particularly interesting for 2 things: breakdown theory and fatalism. Now, according to Kautsky, so breakdown theory, Marxism, sometimes it's called the theory of the breakdown, the Kladderadatsch, Zusammenbruch is the German word, the falling together, the collapsing, the breakdown. And what I found really interesting with this is that the term breakdown theory, right, the theory of the breakdown, is actually something that originates, claims Kautsky anyway, with Bernstein in his polemic against Ernst Berthold Bax, which is kind of the start of the whole thing, where he basically, Bernstein takes a lot of the crudities in Bax's position and starts to ascribe that to Marxism, and to say, well, look, this is a reflection of this kind of vulgar Marxism that Bax represents, and maybe we need time for a rethink. And people are thinking, okay, is that really what he's saying, or is it just kind of open-ended, as I talked at the start? But yes, Kautsky makes the point that that's where the term in Bernstein originates, and it says, at that time, in the 2nd article of his series, he took as his point of departure the 3rd paragraph of the resolution on the economic tasks of the working class, which had been submitted to the International's London Congress in 1896. In the German version, and this is important, so this is a really bizarre thing. We've gone from the kind of meta level of Marxist theories of strategy and everything down to a particular sentence in a resolution, in a German resolution, the German version of the resolution, right? That then Bernstein proceeds to make quite a lot out of. So stick with me. And it says in the German version, not in the English, not in the French version, it's very complicated. It says, at present, economic development is already so advanced that a crisis may soon occur. And Kautsky replies, well, what kind of crisis? What does soon mean? And there's always this thing, the idea that a crisis would occur every 10 years. August Bebel once predicted that by the end of the 19th century, pretty much, everything would fall apart, and, semi-jokingly, but whatever. And but Bernstein basically then takes this sentence and says, aha, this is basically reflective of everything that I think is wrong with Marxist theory as is constituted in the form of the international socialist movement today, and can also be found, and this is where, as Kautsky says, he expands his critique beyond Bax and some nonsense that Bax is coming up with, to Marxism, the Communist Manifesto, to Capital, to Engels, etc., itself, right? And he says, and Kautsky says, it is a bit bold to erect a critique of modern day socialism on the basis of this harmless and not exactly clear sentence, but that is exactly what Bernstein does. And so he's saying that, look, basically, we've got a situation now where we are waiting passively for this breakdown to occur by itself, and then automatically, with the kind of fatalism, we will assume political power. And Kautsky makes the point, no, that's not what we are about as a party. Yes, things might collapse, but our role as a party of opposition to prepare the proletariat, as we'll see, to raise it politically, intellectually, organizationally, etc. And he says Bernstein will search in vain for such things. Maybe, he says, you'll find such things in the ideas of Bax. I don't know a lot about Bax, but certainly not in Marx and Engels. And here, my big claim of the day, Kautsky, the fatalist. If I had a penny for every time I heard that, I wouldn't be teaching German. Kautsky, the fatalist, it is quite possibly the case. I haven't gone, and done the kind of archive rap work for this particular thing, because I'm working on something else at the moment. But you can hear, there's a quote from Bernstein here, where basically Kautsky is accused of fatalism, and maybe for the first time. He says, according to this view, sooner or later a business crisis of tremendous force and magnitude will, due to the misery it produces, so passionately inflame minds against the capitalist economic system, so forcefully convince the masses of the possibility under the rule of the system of managing the existing productive forces for the good of the whole, that the movement directed against the system will assume irresistible force, and under the pressure it exerts, the system itself will hopelessly collapse. In other words, the inevitable great economic crisis will escalate into an all-encompassing social crisis, the result of which will be the political rule of the proletariat as the only revolutionary class that is conscious of its aims, as well as the transformation of society in a socialist sense that will take place under the rule of this class. So, if you were to remove that quote from Bernstein and put it into, Cold War historiography, a lot of Trotskyist historiography, the SPD, basically, it might not be word for word the same, but the same driving, a very similar driving idea behind it would be there. Computer's frozen again, 2 seconds. Won't spend too much time on this again, long quotes, but it's the Bernstein in one of the articles tries to develop a critique of Marxist theory of value. He's not the only one to do that, by the way. There are actually much more informed and I think better critiques, one of which remains untranslated, which was written by one Karl Liebknecht, who was a kind of neo-Kantian influenced thinker and developed his own critique. But for Bernstein, you can see that what Kautsky does, he traces Bernstein's views on this across the articles and then how they find reflection in the book. And basically, he comes to the view that, well, you have the Marxist theory of value, you have marginal utility, and sometimes you can use one, sometimes you can kind of use the other, right? It doesn't really matter. And Kautsky replies, well, unfortunately, he omits to mention the purpose for which one of the other theory is justified, and this somewhat limits the value of his discoveries. This is again one of the great discoveries he claims to have ushered in that the theorists of one tendency, as well as the other, i.e., marginal utility theory and Marxist and value theory, as well as apply their theory indiscriminately wherever theory of value is required. In the entirety of economic literature, we are not aware of a single incident where a researcher would on one occasion use the Marxist theory of value, another time for a different purpose, then turn to the theory of marginal utility, or where you could even consider such an approach to be possible. And the underlying point here that Kautsky is making is that Bernstein is essentially started to assimilate many of the critiques within German academia in particular, and we'll see why they're important in a second, to undermine social democracy. Kautsky continues, value is thus not a purely theoretical concept, as Bernstein claims, but a reality. There is no such thing as a Marxist and a Revisionist value, but just one commodity value, which was perceived and studied long before Marx or Germans were alive. So we've had fatalism. Another thing was massively widespread, particularly in academia and academic discussions of Marxism within the 20th century and still to this day, is this idea that there's Marxism on the one hand, whether it's a good thing or not, and then a much more flattened, deterministic reading of it, either in Engels or in Kautsky or in both, right? And again, much has been said against that. I think many writers in the Weekly Worker have pointed out how kind of nonsense that is. But it's a long-standing one. And what's interesting is that it seems to be that again, one of the first instances where this is used to distinguish between the Marxism of Marx and the Marxism of Engels, if you like, is from an academic who's kind of in this, sympathetic to the party, Dr. Ludwig Volkmann. And he flags this idea for the first time, and Bernstein kind of then takes up a lot of his ideas, Volkmann's ideas, in trying to undermine some of the claims of Marxism, but with slightly different outlines. And Kautsky says, you know, it's a priori somewhat implausible that Engels worked together with Marx for a lifetime without either of becoming aware of the fundamental difference between them that Volkmann claims, or that it took Dr. Volkmann to arrive on the scene to establish such a difference for the first time. Now, the other question, we talked about the theory of immiseration, which again relates to fatalism, relates to the theory of the breakdown. And Bernstein basically produces a rather thin series of arguments to say that, look, not only do we have this idea in the SPD that this is inevitable collapse, people will, the workers will inevitably be impoverished and immiserized, to use that term. Not only have we got that, but it also goes back to Marx and Engels. And he takes a quote from the Communist Manifesto, where he says, look, you know, with increasing social antagonisms comes the increasing drudgery and slavery, etc., mental, physical, of the proletariat. And then Kautsky points out, well, look, if you go a few lines down, Bernstein, we also talk about the other side of the coin, which Marx and Engels bring out, because many people before and at the same time as Marx and Engels made the point that, yes, capitalism will impoverish the proletarians, but Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto also make the point right underneath the section where Bernstein quotes, as it happens, that capitalism also produces the basis for the working class to organize itself, to educate itself, to start to challenge the political economy of capital itself. And that's what what you could call the subjective factor of it, empowerment in today's kind of nonsense language. And again, the fundamental tenets of social democracy, the points that Kautsky makes over again: the thirst for knowledge, broadening the political horizons of the proletariats, and the civil liberties and rights as the light and air of the proletariat. Very famous quote, as we all know. And Kautsky said, the fact that the capitalist mode of production leads to growing misery, to a continuous decline in small businesses, and to increasing overproduction was also pointed out by other socialists before Marx, as well as other socialists working independently of him during his lifetime. As I just said, what Marx and Engels alone discovered along the tendencies in capitalist society that brought the proletariat down were those that lift it up. This is precisely what made Marx and Engels stand out as thinkers. Unlike other socialists, they did not merely like the growing subjugation of the proletariat, but also its growing indignation, not merely the increase in its misery and degradation, but also the growth in its education and organization, its maturity and power. This is something which, of course, the vulgar critics of the so-called theory of immiseration all too easily forget. They are actually criticizing nothing else than pre-Marxist theories of immiseration. And Kautsky makes the point here about fatalism. He says here, with Bernstein's kind of misrepresentation of Marx and Engels and his understanding of necessity, historical necessity, we get a situation of what Bernstein's trying to get at. So for Bernstein, he recognizes necessity not in terms of the something necessary posed by social development itself as an open-ended opportunity, but actually where people are forced in a Zwangslage. It's a difficult term to translate, but it's almost when you're in kind of checkmate, you're forced to move, you're in a situation where you have to do something. That's how he understands necessity. So for him, Marxist theory becomes a teaching that economic development will eventually create such a predicament in which people will have no choice but to bring about socialism. This is how he understands the Marxist theory of the collapse. Again, very important scare quotes. It's not difficult to refute it. Sorry. I'll speed up a little bit here just to go on to program. Program is slightly misnamed, at least in what I've done so far in the translation, because as with Parvus, what is at stake here in this section is a move away from the kind of more theoretical aspects, the theory of the breakdown, immiseration, capitalist concentration, is it happening or not, to looking at a series of statistics published by the German Empire in the 1880s and the 1890s. I think one is 1882 and the other is 1895, where it looks at occupational statistics and what people do for their work and the number of enterprises, firms within particular sectors. That also relates to the agricultural question, which Kautsky also touches on here, but obviously wrote a book about that as well, which Lenin, I think, called Capital Volume 4, the fourth volume of Capital, something like that. A very important study about, to what extent is agriculture confirming some of the predictions that Marx made. And Kautsky is actually quite clear in this text. He says that in his inaugural address to what we know as the First International, Marx actually, some of the predictions that Marx very tentatively made there didn't come into fruition, and then he explains why he thinks that's the case, right? So he's not just looking to dig up Marx quotes and then justify them. Kautsky himself is also trying to develop a theory of Marxism. I think he's quite original in that as well, one must say. You think here, again, it's translated in Day and Guido's volume. To what extent is the Communist Manifesto obsolete? It's a very useful discussion on this basis. Talks about the new middle class. I won't go with that into too much detail, but essentially Kautsky makes the point that it's the proletariat that really is the class that will bring around change, because a lot of these layers, they're not politically significant, they're not politically coherent, and so on and so forth. And in this particular case, a lot of the things that in this particular section, a lot of the points that Bernstein and his supporters make is that they kind of downplay the significance of the political, in a sense, right? So for them, it's more about the growing economic power within capitalism of the working class, the rise of trade unionism, etc., that will start to call into question the logic of capitalist society, whereas for Kautsky, it's very much, no, it's about politics and the political process. And Mark Mulholland wrote a good, interesting piece in the Weekly Worker a while back on, I think it's called the Enigma of Kautsky, and he makes the point, the political process is the highest form of the proletarian class struggle in this text, and I think that's absolutely right. But then he makes a point that I actually disagree with, when he says the Bolsheviks incidentally were to definitively reject Kautsky on this point. Well, they did, but only much later on, is the point I would make, after the much water passed between the bridge, where Bukharin essentially, and I think Lars spoke about this at a communist university a long time ago, the shifting focus in Bolshevism on democracy, where Bukharin essentially says, well, now we need a dictatorship, and that's kind of all for the past. I think it's wrong for Mark to say we do not get very far if we ally the real political and temperamental differences between Bolshevism and Kautskyism, because this is talking about 1919 and not 1901. Just finally, on the final section on tactics, Kautsky poses the rhetorical question, dürfen wir siegen? Are we allowed to win? Might we be victorious? And Bernstein, again, this is something that's lost in the literature often, the secondary literature. Bernstein is the one here that is the pessimist. He thinks that basically the productive forces themselves, so again, you get a certain fatalism in Bernstein, right? He says that, productive forces themselves are not sufficiently developed for our party to be victorious, nor is the proletariat in a position to take power. And Kautsky says, well, look, we don't know about what exactly will play out in the future. However, our task as revolutionaries to do the kind of things that I've been talking about here, increase the intellectual, organizational, and moral power of the proletariat as an oppositional force with an oppositional party. And that is the key task that Bernstein and others are calling into question and must therefore be opposed for. That is everything. Sorry for slightly running over time, but hopefully quite a few things to discuss. Cheers.